I was a child, I grew up hearing the legend of La Llorona, like many others in Mexico. They talked about a woman who, in her despair, had lost her children and now wandered by rivers and lakes, crying for them. It was a story they told me to scare me before bed, and although at the time it made my skin crawl, I always saw it as just a legend. Nothing more. But what I experienced a few years ago completely changed my perspective. It was summer, and I had gone to visit my grandmother in a small town in the southern part of the country, a place where time seemed to stand still, where there wasn't much to do except walk through the fields and enjoy the tranquility. That night, the heat inside the house was unbearable, so I decided to go for a walk. It was almost 11 at night, but I wasn't worried. I knew the paths well, and besides, the town was safe. I remember the sky was clear, the moon shining brightly enough to light up the dirt path that led to the river. I walked calmly, listening to the crunch of my shoes on the stones and the soft murmur of the water in the distance. There was a cool breeze that made the day's heat more bearable. Everything seemed peaceful, and I was enjoying that moment of solitude. However, as I approached the river, something changed. A strange sensation began to creep over me, as if the air had become thicker, heavier. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, perhaps some memory of the scary stories I was told as a child. But the unease didn't go away. As I walked along the riverbank, I felt a shiver run down my spine, as if someone was watching me from the shadows. I kept walking, trying to ignore that feeling. But then, I heard it. A wail. Faint at first, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. I stopped in my tracks. I thought it might be the wind rustling the tree branches or the water hitting the rocks, but the sound was too clear, too human. I stood in silence, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The wailing repeated, soft but constant, like the sobbing of a woman in the distance. My first reaction was rational. Maybe someone from the town had gone for a walk near the river. Maybe someone was going through a rough time. I called out, but no one answered. The wailing continued, and the sense of unease grew with each passing second. I decided to get closer to the water, to see if I could find the person who was crying. That's when I saw her. A figure, standing by the river, right where the moon barely managed to light up the shore. I couldn't make out her details clearly, but it was unmistakably a woman. She was standing still with her back to me, her head tilted toward the water. The wailing seemed to come from her, a sound that resonated in the air, filled with sadness. I felt a mixture of fear and curiosity. Something inside me told me I should walk away, but my feet wouldn't move. I wanted to understand what was happening, to make sure it wasn't just a coincidence or, worse, that someone really needed help. I took a step forward, and at that moment, the wailing changed. It became sharper, more desperate. The figure by the river started to move, but not like a normal person. It was a slow, unnatural movement, as if her feet weren't touching the ground. In that instant, an indescribable cold swept through my body. It wasn't the kind of cold you feel from the wind or the weather. It was something deeper, something that chills you from the inside out. My heart was pounding. Every part of me was screaming to run, but my legs remained glued to the ground. The figure slowly turned, and although the darkness prevented me from seeing her face clearly, something about her posture, the way she moved, filled me with a fear I had never felt before. Suddenly, everything went silent. The river, the wind, the crickets. Everything stopped, as if the world had ceased to move. It was just me, the woman by the river, and that deafening silence. And then, when I thought it couldn't get worse, I heard a barely audible whisper escape her lips. My children. It was at that moment that my body finally reacted. Without a second thought, I turned and started to run. I didn't look back, nor did I dare take a deep breath until I was far from the river, almost at the entrance of my grandmother's house. When I arrived, I slammed the door shut, leaning against it, trying to catch my breath. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen that night. Who would believe me? They'd think it was just my imagination, the result of the legends I was told as a child. but I knew that what I saw, what I heard, was real. Days later, when the heat became unbearable again, I found myself in the kitchen with my uncle and decided to mention what had happened, hoping for some logical explanation. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I brought it up as a curiosity, something I had seemed to see. My uncle, a robust and practical man, looked at me seriously for a moment before speaking. "You're not the first to hear her," he said. "Many here have seen or heard her near the river, always at night. They say it's La Llorona, searching for her children or maybe waiting for someone else to take with her." Those words sent a chill down my spine. Although I had always been skeptical, I couldn't help but feel there was something more to that legend, something real. Since that night, I avoided going near the river alone. And every time I hear a story about La Llorona, I can't help but remember that wail, that whisper, and that figure by the water, who is probably still wandering along the riverbanks, searching for what she will never find. I always thought the stories about La Llorona were just legends, the kind grandparents tell to scare children and keep them away from rivers or lakes at night. I grew up in a small town where these kinds of tales were passed down from generation to generation, and although I had heard many stories about her, I never thought I would find myself involved in something so strange and terrifying. My name is Pablo, and I was 17 years old when what I'm about to tell you happened. At that time, my friends and I spent most of our nights near an old stone bridge that connected the town to the main road. The bridge crossed over a river, not very deep but with fast and treacherous currents during the rainy season. Over the years, there had been accidents in that river, even deaths. The elders of the town said the place was cursed and that if you stayed long enough at night, you could hear the crying of a woman. They always said it was La Llorona. We, young and skeptical, used to laugh at those stories. It was common for us to go to the bridge at night just to drink and talk. It never crossed our minds that the legends could be more than that, simple tales to scare the superstitious. One summer night, everything changed. There was a warm breeze and the sky was clear. I remember there were 5 of us that night: me, Daniel, Luis, Claudia, and Diego. As usual, we sat at the edge of the bridge, chatting and laughing. We had been there for about 2 hours when Luis, in a mocking tone, mentioned that it was almost midnight, the hour of La Llorona. We laughed as always, but deep down, something in his words unsettled me. That's when we heard it for the first time. At first, the sound was faint, like a murmur coming from the river. We didn't think much of it. We assumed it might be the wind or some animal in the water. However, the sound grew louder, clearer. It was a wail, a soft cry, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. We fell silent, all of us. We listened carefully, trying to find a logical explanation. Daniel was the first to speak, asking if we had heard that, with a nervous smile on his face. Claudia said it must have been the wind, but her tone showed she wasn't very sure either. The crying continued. This time, closer, deeper. It was the sound of a woman, sobbing in the darkness. None of us dared to move. We were glued to the ground, staring at the river, not knowing what to do. Diego, who had always been the most superstitious of the group, was the first to suggest that we leave. "This doesn't feel right," he said, standing up. "We're getting into something we don't understand." Luis, always the rational one, laughed. He replied, saying not to be a coward, it was nothing more than the wind, that La Llorona didn't exist and it was just a story for kids. But even he seemed more uncomfortable than usual. As the wailing grew louder, a cold sensation began to fill the air. It wasn't a normal breeze. This cold felt like it was seeping into our skin, into our bones, as if the atmosphere itself was changing. That's when we saw her. On the other side of the bridge, about 50 meters from where we were, a figure started to take shape. It was a woman, standing by the railing of the bridge, looking toward the river. We couldn't see her face clearly, but her silhouette was unmistakable. She was wearing some kind of robe or long dress, which glowed faintly under the moonlight. "What is that?" Claudia whispered, grabbing Daniel's arm. No one answered. We were paralyzed. The figure didn't move, but her presence was undeniable. Something about her posture, the way she stood there, made us feel she wasn't a normal person. "It's just someone walking," Luis tried to say, but his voice trembled. But right at that moment, the figure started to move. Slowly. With an unnatural fluidity, she began to walk in our direction, across the bridge. As she approached, the crying grew louder, more heart-wrenching. There was no doubt now. It was a wail full of pain, of desperation. And the worst part was, it didn't seem like she was actually walking. It was as if she was floating, as if her feet weren't touching the ground. Diego took off running without saying a word, and the rest of us followed. I don't remember exactly what happened next. I just know we didn't stop running until we reached Daniel's house, which was the closest to the bridge. We locked ourselves inside, breathing heavily, not knowing how to process what we had just seen. No one said anything for a while. Finally, Luis was the first to speak, still trying to find a logical explanation. "It was nothing," he said, though he didn't seem convinced himself. Maybe someone was playing a prank. But deep down, we all knew it wasn't a prank. What we had seen, what we had felt, was something else. Something we didn't understand. The next day, I told my grandfather what had happened. When I mentioned the figure and the crying, his face changed. He remained silent for a moment before speaking. "That has happened before," he told me in a serious voice. "They say that woman lost her child in the river many years ago. No one knows exactly when, but since then, her soul wanders the bridge, searching for him." I didn't know what to think anymore. From that day on, I never went back to the bridge at night. My friends and I never talked about what happened again. But after that, we were never the same. And although I tried to convince myself that it was all a misunderstanding, part of me knows that what we saw that night on the bridge was real. And her wail. That wail still echoes in my mind every time I remember the river. My name is Manuel, and although I've always been skeptical about legends and ghosts, what I experienced that night completely changed the way I see things. I never thought something so supernatural could happen to me, but after what I went through, I can no longer deny what I saw and felt. It all happened when I was working as a night guard at a nature reserve near my town. The reserve is a peaceful place during the day. It's a popular spot for families to come for picnics and hikes. However, at night, the atmosphere changes. The lake, which sparkles under the sun during the day, takes on a mysterious air when darkness falls. Local legends have always centered around that lake. They say that many years ago, a woman lost her children there, drowned in its waters. Since then, her spirit has found no rest, and at night her crying can be heard on the shore. I've heard that story since I was a child, but I never gave it much importance. To me, it was just another legend, a way to keep curious people away from the lake at night. Even when I started working at the reserve, the story didn't bother me. My shift started at dusk, and part of my job was to do rounds around the lake, making sure there were no intruders or stray animals. I had done it dozens of times without anything strange happening. However, there was one night in particular that would change my thinking forever. It was a cool night in late autumn. The wind was blowing gently, and the sound of dry leaves rustling between the trees was the only thing breaking the silence. Everything was calm. As usual, I began my round around the lake. I walked slowly, flashlight in hand, illuminating the path in front of me. I had already passed the halfway point of the lake when the air began to change. First, I noticed the wind stopped completely, as if the entire place had been frozen in a sort of pause. The second thing I felt was a sudden chill. It wasn't the typical cool breeze of the night, but an intense cold that seeped into my bones, making me feel uncomfortable. I stopped for a moment, trying to calm myself, telling myself it was probably just the change in temperature from being so close to the water. But then I heard something, At first, I thought it was the wind picking up again, a distant whisper coming from the lake. However, as I listened more closely, the sound became clearer. It was a wail. The soft cry of a woman, so low it almost blended with the movement of the water, but clear enough to put me on edge. I froze, staring at the lake. I didn't see anything unusual, but the crying continued, now unmistakable. My instinct told me I should leave, but something, a mix of curiosity and skepticism, kept me there. I turned on my flashlight and directed the beam toward the water, slowly scanning the shoreline. That's when I saw it. A few yards away, right at the shore, there was a figure. It was a woman, or at least it seemed like it. She was dressed in something white, a long, tattered dress that looked soaked. Her hair hung over her face and her head was tilted down, looking at the water. I didn't move. Fear had me frozen, but there was also something about the scene that wouldn't let me look away. The crying continued, now clearly coming from that figure. I hesitated for a second before taking a step back, keeping my flashlight on her. My mind was trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was someone who had gotten lost, or some cruel prank, but something in the air told me that wasn't the case. Everything around me felt strange, like time had stopped moving. The figure didn't move, but the crying grew louder, more heart-wrenching. Without meaning to, I took another step back, and that's when the woman lifted her head. I couldn't see her face clearly, but the little I managed to make out filled me with an indescribable terror. Her eyes were empty, dark, and her mouth was still letting out that wail that seemed to come from the depths of her being. I didn't wait any longer. Without thinking twice, I turned and started running. My heart was pounding in my ears, and even though I knew no one was chasing me, I felt like something was right behind me, watching me as I ran away. I didn't stop until I reached the small cabin where my workstation was. I slammed the door shut, trying to catch my breath. The place was completely silent now, but the echo of her crying still rang in my mind. I didn't go back out that night. I stayed in the cabin, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally rose, I did my best to convince myself that it had all been a product of my imagination, that maybe I was just tired or had let myself get carried away by the stories I had heard so many times. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. The next day, I told a coworker what had happened, an older man who had been working at the reserve for over 30 years. When I mentioned the crying and the figure by the shore, his expression changed. He looked at me intently before speaking. "You saw the woman of the lake, didn't you?" he said quietly. I nodded, unable to say anything else. "You're not the first to see her. They say that many years ago, a mother lost her children in that lake. The children drowned while playing in the water, and she, consumed by grief, ended her own life there. Since then, her soul wanders the shore searching for her children." I had never believed in those stories until that moment. What I saw that night by the lake wasn't just an illusion or a trick of my mind. It was something more, something I can't explain. Since then, I've avoided doing rounds near the lake, especially at night. And although I try not to think about it too much, every now and then, when the wind blows hard at night, I swear I can still hear, in the distance, the wail of a woman.